and get started. I remember. So welcome to our final artist talk for our climate change exhibition, Fire and Ice, Our Changing Landscape. We're really grateful to have Suze Woolf and Lorena Williams with us. And let's see, Lorena zooming in from Colorado, and we've got Suze zooming in from Seattle. So they would not be able to be here in person otherwise. We don't really normally have that kind of budget. So we're just really grateful that Zoom exists and you guys had the time to be with us today. So for those of you tuning in, we are recording this. We will get it loaded up thanks to Lauren on our YouTube channel in the next day or two. And we do have other virtual talks that we did in connection with Fire and Ice, never mind some other things, but those are on our YouTube channel as well. So be sure and check those out if you've missed them. The show itself is up through September 26th, which really isn't that far away. And then we get to pack it all up and ship it back to everybody. And then we'll be working on installing the next show, which is the artist Hillary Baker from Ojai, and her show is called Wildlife on the Edge. And Hillary does really interesting graphic portraits of common wildlife with an urban backdrop. Complementing her work, we've added in some trail cam footage of common wildlife that we would find here in our area. And also information about the Wallace-Annenberg Wildlife Crossing in Agoura Hills, which is not too far from us, and is actually going to be, they claim, the largest wildlife crossing in the world, which is really exciting and should help with things like the mountain lion population, which has gotten a bit devastated in that region. We also just opened a photography show all about the Oceano Dunes, and that's courtesy of photographer Bob Canepa from San Luis Obispo. Gorgeous black and white photographs. You don't want to miss it. And we've added some information about the local flora and fauna you might see in our dunes. One of the things I learned in preparing for the show was that we have one of the best, if not largest, still intact coastal dune system right here in Central California. So something to really enjoy and take advantage of, and come and see Bob's wonderful artwork. And then mark your calendar for the opening reception for both of those shows. Both artists will be here on Sunday, October 9th from 3 to 5, and everyone is invited to join. So now we're going to go on to our program, and I just want to say thank you to Montecito Bank and Trust for being a sponsor of these wonderful virtual programs that we're able to do. So I'm just going to very, very briefly introduce the speakers and then let them really get into their backgrounds rather than me doing that. And I just wanted to say that, you know, preparing for a show like Fire and Ice takes a long time. And so I was working on this show for several years. And the internet was a boon for me, and finding other past shows and finding artists. And lo and behold, in looking at climate change exhibitions that had happened before, I found a mention of one. I think it even might have been called Fire and Ice, that Suze Woolf was part of, and another artist, Anna McKee, who focused on ice, that we also were able to secure and have in this exhibition. So that is how I, excuse me, I found Suze. And because of Suze, we found Lorena, because they partner up on their artwork to a wonderful degree. It's really special. Lorena is a wildlands firefighter with the Forest Service, and a writer, an amazing creative writer, and also a teacher. So that's all I'm going to say, other than I think your pairing with the art form that you have in our show is just a marriage made in heaven. So, and I know our visitors really love it and spend a lot of time with it. So with that, thank you again for being here. And I'm going to turn it over, I think, to Suze. I think you're starting first.
So you should all see a slide of Lorena and me. Are you seeing it?
Yes, we're seeing it.
Okay, great. I'll just get going then. So Lorena is actually going to start with a reading from one of our previous projects.
All right, you've got the slides going. Thanks, Suze. Hi, everybody. It's really wonderful to be here. Well, here I'm at my house in Colorado, but it's nice to be with all of you virtually. And I'm going to sort of kick us off here with a little reading from one of the earlier pieces that Suze and I did together. In 2019, we really started collaborating on her paintings paired with some of what I call my tree stories. And originally, and this has morphed and changed over time, but I would ask Suze a lot of questions about the trees that she had painted. I would ask the situation of the tree, the fire that burned the tree, what Suze's relationship was with the tree. I got the latitude and longitude of the tree. I would find the aspect that it was on. And I really wanted to tell the story of the tree or of someone's relationship with it. And Stehekin Sentinel is a good example of that. This particular tree is from the North Cascades, and the fire was in 2010, the Rainbow Bridge fire. And there was a rumor about what started this particular fire. And the rumor was that someone burning love letters started the fire. And it's just, I'd like to kick off with this one to give you guys a taste of what some of the trees that aren't in this exhibit maybe represent. And this piece is called Stehekin Sentinel. Sentinel, being an individual or part of a population potentially susceptible to an infection or infestation that is being monitored for the appearance or recurrence of the causative pathogen or parasite. Sentinel, a soldier or guard whose job is to stand and keep watch. This painting is a love letter to the Stehekin Sentinels. In it reflects the purples of lupine sprouted years after the fire also a love letter, a bright burst of passion. Wasn't it a love letter lit in the forest which started this wildfire? That's the rumor, you know. What is it about the woods that inspire ardor? We come here with loved ones to reunite. We come here alone in exuberance. It is where our imaginations are most awake, our spirits unbound, and not surprisingly, where we come to heal. We have all burned love letters in the woods. The trees whisper a soothing reply, but when our zeal grows reckless, the trees become the love letters we burn, the 1,000 matchsticks of dog hair thicket sounding fury into the night sky. These modern forests are, after all, the result of a misunderstood relationship, producing sentinels such as this one, a susceptible tree infested with bark beetles, defenseless against subsequent fires. Unlike us humans, however, forests seem ever willing to forgive us our wrongs, to unearth gold and violet out of blackness. Again, that was Stehekin Sentinel. And that just was sort of a warm up to pass it over to Suze, who I'd like to introduce as the artist whose paintings you're about to see, or maybe have gotten to see in person, as a matter of fact. So Suze, I'll pass it on to you.
Thanks. That poem still gives me goosebumps. So I'm a lifelong outdoor person, and all the places I go, I try to paint there too. So here's Zion National Park. This is up by Mount Rainier. This is out in the Canadian Rockies. This is at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. That's on Mount Rainier again, looking towards Mount Adams. Here I am up in Stehekin, or near Stehekin, where that poem came from. Only that's Rainbow Creek, not the Rainbow Fire. And in the Central Cascades, that's one of the alpine lakes. So these have always given me enormous joy to see these places, to paint them. This is from Capitol Reef National Park. I've been an artist in residence in quite a few parks. Zion, North Cascades, Glacier, the US Glacier, for the Grand Canyon Trust in the House Rock Valley, in Capitol Reef. And I've also been an artist in residence in various art colonies. I was going to say, you are the artist in residence, usually in the parks. There's only one at a time. But in the art colonies, you get to be with a bunch of other artists, and it's a very validating experience. So, but all these places I go, I'm seeing burned over areas. Since I grew up in the Northwest and have done a great deal of hiking there, it was a big surprise. This was in 2008 when I would go back to a familiar place and find it burned. Kind of shocking, but kind of beautiful in its own bizarre way too. So these are a bunch of statistics I'm not going to go through in detail, just to say that, you know, in the state of Washington over the last 10 years or something, it seems like it's not every year, but many years we keep having the biggest fire ever. And the last National Climate Assessment suggested that we would see 6 times as many fires. And certainly many of us are living this experience now. So I started painting what I was seeing. You can see the photo of the place and the painting that I did. This is now 14 years ago, I think. And these are mostly places around Washington State. So this is up in the North Cascades. As an artist, this one always amuses me because there's a kind of old rule in painting that warm colors advance and cool colors recede. But I think I can show that you can break that rule successfully. This is also in the North Cascades. This is in the North Cascades as well. And this is more in the Central Cascades, several years after that fire, back to the North Cascades. So at this point, I was still painting whole landscapes that had been burned. And in 2011, I was a resident at the Banff Center in Alberta, Canada. And I was there in the winter. I can remember it was very cold. I would wear my down parka and keep my camera inside my parka so that it wouldn't freeze up. And I hiked around and looked at all these places. I started out as usual doing landscapes, but you know, they gave me the biggest studio space I'd ever had. And everything that I put on the wall looked so small and insignificant that I thought, I have to start painting bigger. So this was the first really large one that I did. It's 75 inches high and 50 inches wide. That was another one. And bless her, one of the administrative assistants who came around during open studio night looked at these on the wall, you know, bigger than me, and said, you should take those out and wrap them around real trees. And the idea had not occurred to me, but it was a brilliant suggestion. And when I got back to Washington with the help of a bunch of friends, and after I had varnished these paintings, we did just that in the winter. And it was an aesthetic high for me. It was an amazing experience. I looked at them and I thought, I don't know whether I'm seeing the future of the tree, the inside of the tree, but it sure, you know, it grabbed your attention. So another thing I learned in that residency at the Banff Center, they usually have a famous visiting artist. So Simon Starling won the Turner Prize in the UK, which is a big deal. It's like, especially when the pound was worth more, it's like 25,000 pounds. And he gave a talk in which he talked about a number of his projects. This particular one called Shed Boat Shed, you can look it up. He was exhibiting in a museum in Germany, and I don't remember the city, but it was on the Rhine. And he poked around the area, found a barn by the river, a shed, bought it from the farmer, disassembled it, turned it into a boat, rebuilt it as a boat, floated it down the river, and then reassembled it as a shed inside the museum. And this actually kind of irritated me. I was like, well, what's the viewer going to get out of this? But I have to say the next project he described really, I fell in love with and really was an inspiration to me. This is 2004 or something. And he rode a prototype electric bicycle through a desert in Spain. And he made watercolors of the vegetation he passed from the exhaust of the bicycle, which of course is air and water. So that was like a light bulb to me. Oh my goodness, I've got to connect the process with the meaning somehow. And I went down to the sculpture shop and borrowed a soldering iron and started making drawings of the burned over areas I was seeing with the soldering iron. And the rice paper I had brought with me just kind of fell apart. And luckily there was a Japanese sumi painter in the studio next to me who gave me some hemp-based paper, which didn't burn up from the soldering iron. And I was inspired by his work to think of scroll forms. So I came away from that whole experience thinking a lot harder about why was I painting landscapes? What was it that grabbed me? The other interesting artistic thing about these pieces is how little it takes to convey a sense of deep space. A few lines that are different sizes, some occlusion, one crossing another, and all of a sudden you have the space of a burned forest in winter. I tried actually burning the paintings. It's a little tough to see. This is again from in the Banff area in winter. The foreground trees are burned in with that soldering iron. Watercolor paper is very tough. It actually only showed any signs of actually catching at the very, very edges. And I did indeed keep a bucket of water and a bucket of sand in the studio. I tried using my daughter's chef's torch on this particular one. The foreground trees again are burned in with a chef's torch. But I felt as if it wasn't really coming across, that it just looked like pigment. So I tried casting paper into molds made from burned logs. And I did learn that you should never dump India ink into the paper pulp in the mold, because then you can't get it out of the mold. That's the top piece. And I used those molds in making several pieces, taking the same log from multiple angles and painting it, casting it, and making pyrographic burned drawings with the soldering iron. And I began to realize that what really got me, made my kind of neurons buzz, was the char. And that I didn't have to paint the whole landscape. And in fact, these were almost landscapes themselves, that each little chunk had its own dimension, iridescence. And I've always been fascinated by things that are both random and structured at the same time. And char is definitely like that. So the first two I did, as I showed previously, were rectangular on, cut pieces of big watercolor paper on a roll. I should point out, these are 52 inches high because that's the width of a roll of watercolor paper. And I was literally hiking along a trail as artist in residence in Zion, looking at some burned snags, when I suddenly thought, wait a minute, I'm working on paper. These are watercolor on paper. I don't have stretchers. They don't have to be a rectangle. I can make the paper any shape I want. So I started tearing the paper to match the contours of the tree. And I've pretty much been doing that ever since. I have been an artist in residence in a number of places that are, high arid forested. And there are some people, some foresters, who think that in catastrophic burns in these places, those forests won't come back because they won't have the right growing conditions anymore with climate change. So these are all from various trees from Zion National Park. Even the east side of our North Cascades here in Washington, I always think of the Cascades as a very wet, cold mountain range, but east of the range, in the rain shadow, it's quite dry. So these are both trees from when I was artist in residence in Stehekin, Washington. And the first one, knotted, obviously had issues before it was burned. All those strange knobs and shapes on it. There's another one from the Rainbow Creek fire, just like the poem that Lorena read. And the one on the right is actually from Mesa Verde, from when we were both at a small residency called Willowtail Springs in the Four Corners area. I've tried installing these a number of ways. The most exciting was hanging them from the ceiling. This was the first time I did this at a regional museum here in the Northwest. And then I did it again in a different small regional museum. And I was very excited about how they looked. I've always thought, and standing in the back, they're all on a black background. That is, they're mounted on a black backing. And so someday I would love to show them where you see nothing but the black coming in. And then when you walk around, you see the painting. It made me start thinking about fabric, about hanging them from fabric. There are two phenomena in burns that, or one of the phenomena that's always interested me. When you're walking through a set of linear forms, you sometimes have this impression that the row closest to you is stationary, but the ones that you're seeing through the gaps are moving. That you have this sense of movement that I think of it as kind of like the picket fence phenomenon. If you're seeing something through a picket fence, it seems like it moves in a way that the fence doesn't. So I thought fabric might be an interesting way to deepen this experience of the burned trees. And this is where Lorena and I started working on stories for these individual trees. So you can see some, this was its first installation in a downtown storefront window in Seattle. And there again, the stories made them even more compelling. I had been part of a touring exhibit called Environmental Impact that I was traveling previously, and I proposed doing 30 sets of these trees to the curator. That was my concept sketch. This was a studio mock-up of what it would look like. That's actually me on the left and Arissa Brown, a textile artist whose help was absolutely essential in doing this project. And here it is at its opening in St. Augustine, Florida. And I am thrilled by this photo because you can tell from what people are wearing that it was not staged. And you could see how interested people are. They're really absorbed. They're reading. I think of this in some ways as a book you could walk through. Here's another photo from the same installation. And I'm just, this is my fondest hope, is that people would find these absorbing enough to really look and think. So I'm still continuing to paint burn trees on paper, on large pieces of watercolor paper. And since that exhibit started touring 2-3 years ago now, I've got more to add to the retinue if needed. So this one is from a fire in the North Cascades on the west side, unusual again, the wet side, that actually they had to shut down the power lines from Seattle's main source of hydropower, Ross Dam, because they were arcing in the smoke. So this won a People's Choice Award at a small exhibit. And the award was actually either a small wall in their gallery during one of their other exhibits, or a very large wall at the Kirkland Public Library, which is the town that it's in. And I started working on this I went over and measured the wall at the library, and then the pandemic shutdown happened. it was in some ways good for me in that it gave me a lot of focus. I decided I was going to use the length of a roll of watercolor paper. It's 52 inches wide and it's 10 yards long. So for 3 months, I worked on these every day. There was no place in my house big enough to spread them all out together. I did them in 7 panels because I have learned the hard way that you don't want to make artwork bigger than your car because otherwise it's very hard to transport it from one location to another. Other thing that was, so later in, let's see, 2021, finally, the enormous tree was shown at the Kirkland Public Library. And this was actually quite a thrill, even though it wasn't a museum. It didn't have beautiful lighting. There was the clutter of the checkout stand and children's drawings and so forth underneath it. But together with Lorena and some of my forestry consultants, we developed a reading list. The librarians loved it. I heard from friends that came to visit. Yeah, and Lorena and I and Dave Peterson did a talk together for the library, a remote talk like this. And friends told me who came to see it that if you looked at it for more than about 30 seconds, the librarians would come over and start talking to you about it. So in so many ways, that was a very ideal experience for me. And those are some of the books that were on the reading list. In fact, I met somebody at a residency who was a science communication professor. And I was saying, I was trying to find books for kids about forest fires. Did she know of any? She said, well, I wrote one. And that's actually the one in the middle of that display. And it won some awards. So I was very happy to have an all age reading list. So I set it up so that it could be exhibited horizontally, vertically, or even in columns as it is at the Wildling Museum. So we tried our device of putting this on fabric because that movement suggests the ephemerality of something that I always grew up taking for granted as permanent. And it also gives you a sense of that movement, that same movement I was trying to describe earlier. And of course, Lorena contributed fabulous, emotional, didactic, meaningful text to it that makes it even more profound. And I'm going to turn back over to her, sorry, to read some.
Thanks, Suze. It's been really interesting. Writers don't collaborate a whole lot unless they are, working for some sort of stage or movie scripting. But I had never collaborated before, and Suze and I had both attended an artist residency that she mentioned in Southwest Colorado, near where I live here, and that the woman who had brought us both down had a vision of us collaborating together. She really wanted to see art and science coming together at her locale. And so Suze and I was pretty awkward. Like, how do I collaborate? Do you do paintings? I'm a nonfiction writer. And Suze has had to, bring me along more than once to help keep me going. But the 15 or so early trees that we did together were such an experience for me, both a learning experience and just really stretched me and pushed me. There was poetry, fiction, and nonfiction. And this big tree was yet another big push. And Suze mentioned it to me in 2020. I'm working on this really big tree. Maybe I'll write some stories about it. And in classic form, I said, okay. And then a year later, Suze is like, hey, I'm working on this big tree. You should really write some stories for it. And I'm like, right, I talked about doing that. And what got the momentum going for me, because I am one of these people that really takes the right combination to get some momentum in my writing. I've been a wildland firefighter since 2001. I started when I was 18, and I'm from Eastern Oregon originally. And while I'm no longer a full-time wildland firefighter, I still go on fire assignments, which are 2-week or 21-day assignments. And I landed in Fresno for a fire assignment last summer that was in Yosemite National Park. And talk about big trees that sort of got the wheels turning. And Suze had this big tree that she wanted stories for. And I had just banged my head against the desk. And at some point, you know, you walk up to a sequoia and you go, oh, that's a big tree. This seems like a really good fit for a tree story. And so that got me going. And so for those of you that have seen this exhibit, you can tell that the majority of the tree stories are about that particular visit to California and about the big trees there. And so I'm going to read a few of those. And let me just move it around on my screen here. The first one I'm going to read is called Ugly Yellow. It was the first piece that I wrote upon landing in Fresno. I just remember descending through the clouds into just, and you all know, living in California, the yellow haze of August. And all the next day in my drive out to Mariposa, where I was going to be working, I just kept thinking about that yellow and this particular color that was really hanging over the Fresno area and on that drive out to Mariposa. And so that was the beginning of this poem, Ugly Yellow. There's a color called ugly yellow. It is sickness, 70s lounge chairs, the sky on a California morning. August. Blue oaks thrived in Joni Mitchell's garden, dead now in a stanza of ugly yellow grass grazed so low the dust lifts up with a whisper. The next piece that I'll read came to me on that same drive about 5 minutes later because I drove out of that burned landscape and up and over the hill that goes to Mariposa, where I got back into the blue oaks that had not died either from drought or from fire. And I really wanted to learn more about blue oaks. And so I did some research and came up with this piece. California's endemic blue oaks are dying from prolonged severe drought, the same climate-driven event causing the rash of record-breaking wildfires across the state. I'm one of thousands of firefighters beating back flames at property lines before yet another home, cul-de-sac, or town is engulfed. On the roads from Fresno, I pass several burn scars. New fence lines stretch parallel to the burned posts and tangled black wire. If it ever rains, the charred soil could stabilize and support grass, but the 100-year-old blue oak may never return. To the north, the Dixie Fire handily consumed another 5,000 acres today and is nearing 500,000 total. The radio is reporting on the UN Climate Panel report, which unleashed 14,000 scientific studies to tell us yet again that it's almost too late to stop this. I drive over a pass with shimmering stands of regal verdant oaks and repeat the word aloud, almost. And that's a true story. I was thinking about the trees, the blue oaks. Suze referenced what's called forest type conversion, when a particular forest burns or has some sort of catastrophic event when climate change is pushing the elevation into forest type conversion. You may never see the same trees take root again. So blue oaks may be replaced by manzanita, for example, or by some sort of shrub grassland, but never blue oaks again. And the blue oaks march up in elevation, replaced by lower elevation vegetation. And as I'm thinking about this, I hear on NPR about the UN climate report. It was just it just felt like I needed to be paying attention. Something was telling me I needed to pay attention. So, and then I got to visit Yosemite while I was fighting fire. I got a little break, a couple days where I was able to go into Yosemite and see the sequoias for the first time in my life, though my family is all from California. I was born in Oregon, but had looked at pictures and heard stories from my family throughout my life about the giant sequoias, and in particular, the Mariposa Grove. And so there was this certain compulsion to see it. I had to see the Mariposa Grove. I had never been there. Every summer we heard about how the grove was threatened by this fire or that fire. And I just knew that I had to do whatever I could in my power to see it while I was there. And that is what this next piece is about. Giant sequoias evolved with wildfire. Sequoia cones can remain dormant for up to 20 years, only to release their seeds in the convective heat of a wildfire, a botanical characteristic called serotiny. Though fire is not the only mechanism for seed release, it is by far the most interesting. Sequoias are a type of redwood whose natural range is limited to California's Sierra Nevada. They are the most massive trees on the planet. One of the most impressive stands is the Mariposa Grove of giant sequoias in Yosemite National Park. I grew up in Oregon with stories of my parents' California childhoods spent visiting Yosemite and the Mariposa Grove in particular. In my father's shop was a small container of sequoia branches collected from the ground in the 50s, long before the park sectioned off the largest trees to keep children from taking souvenirs. I studied craft albums filled with Yosemite adventures, among these giants, including black and white photos of families standing in the Wawona tunnel tree. In 2020 and 2021, millions of acres burned in California, including sequoia groves. As a firefighter, I was sent to California to help fight the mega fires. One evening, I was set loose from work early with just enough time to drive to the Mariposa Grove and catch my first glimpse at a giant sequoia. It might be my only chance. I had no idea until I arrived that the road to the grove was closed for repairs after a spring windstorm with 100-mile-an-hour wind. After a 100-mile-an-hour wind felled 15 sequoias. If I wanted to experience my family's Yosemite, I would need to run, literally run, 2 miles up the trail at dusk, see what I could, then hike down in the dark. I started up the hill. In the fading light, I stopped to catch my breath before the first giant. I stood alone on hallowed ground, typically crawling with visitors snapping photos of tree trunks. The forest was still as I climbed over the barrier fence that had been erected for windstorm repairs. I needed to stand in the grove, to feel my smallness, to remember my family's stories. The darkness told me my time was up in the grove. I approached a sequoia alongside the trail and wrapped my arms around as much of it as I could, pressing my face to its rough red bark. And I think I'll stop there to make sure we give enough time for Suze to continue through her tree journey and leave enough time for Q&A. Thanks, everybody.
I just have to say, there's one piece that's on one of those panels where you have a series of very short sentences, some of which are, about how we feel about these trees. We name them. It's perfect. Okay, back to the visuals. So I continue to paint these trees. I've been exploring branches and gone back to some landscapes. I've done some small landscapes once again. These two are 10 years apart. They're in the Central Cascades in the winter. And you can see on the left, the small burned area still had some red needles and some bark, and those are long gone. And then when I say branches, I got really carried away here. This is an interesting technical problem. I actually mounted watercolor paper on a backing and had it I had traced the outline I wanted to use and had it all laser cut and then painted it. So all those gray areas that you see are actually shadows on the wall. And it's been an ongoing technical issue of finding something I can use as a backing, which won't burn up in the laser, which is perhaps ironic. But it is I really enjoy seeing all those shadows. And this particular tree is from a fairly large fire in Washington, just east of Mount Rainier National Park. And it was on a prominence, so I was actually looking up at it and through all those branches. I'm still continuing with branches, although nothing quite as complicated as that last one. And on a trip to Montana, friends took us up onto a ridge where there had been a burn. And the interesting thing about this was on this open ridge top with very dry, sandy soil, a lot of the char was actually kind of sandblasted. So it was, more sculpted as if, Michelangelo had been working on those trees, very smooth undulations. So those two are both from near Missoula, Montana. This is back in Washington. All three of these are from a fire that was actually quite a long time ago. And something that I've done for the first time with that one in the middle. Nope, two more, sorry. I'll come back to it. There's a couple of firsts here for me. I saw the tree on the right in a park, a very large park that used to be called the Endowment Lands for the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, BC. The idea when the university was founded was that they would have all this forest that they could sell logging rights to support the educational mission. And I'm sure it was logged over 100 years ago, logged and burned. They're not doing that anymore. It is now a combination university and city park, and it is huge. And it's amazing to be in this big city and all of a sudden be with many miles of deep forest all around you. But this one is getting very close to returning to soil. I recently heard from a retired Oregon State University professor that, to my enormous surprise, there is more carbon stored in a burned forest than in a logged one. We all, I think, tend to think of it going up in smoke. And of course, we're so sensitive to particulate matter in air that we think even a very small amount of it must, be a huge amount. But most of the carbon remains, if you could see snags, the carbon's there. So it made me feel not quite as bad about painting all these burned trees, which I originally started out of climate anxiety. So one of the things I did with that skinny one from the middle a couple of slides ago, this is in a show in Seattle right now, I asked the gallerist if I could not only hang the picture on the wall, but have 3 feet of space in front of it. So she said yes. When I described what I wanted to do, I built a fire pit. It's actually black paper on the floor and stones surrounding it, although there's a chunk of concrete in there. I found that I could get a gas pump handle on eBay for $14. So there are things in that fire pit that represent the largest carbon emitting sectors in our economy. So there's energy production. There's a large high voltage insulator in there painted black. There is also a propane canister painted black. Transportation is another. I should have said there's some coal in there. We actually have a now preserved area not far from Seattle that was originally an area of coal mines. So that coal is local. And So energy production, transportation, hence the gas pump handle, and agriculture are the largest sectors of carbon emission, I think followed by buildings and HVAC, heating, cooling. So there is a chunk of concrete in the upper left. So the installation plus the painting, I think underlies the point I have been trying to make all these years. And I listened to a talk not long ago by a professor who's just now retiring as the head of the University of Washington's Climate Impacts Group. She said, I used to think that nothing I can do will matter, but I reframed that to the only thing that matters is what I can do. And that's helped me a lot. So that's the former head. And another thing I have to say, and I think Lorena was underlining some of this too, for me, collaborating has been a huge source of creative energy. And I have so many people to thank for everything I've learned about forests from scientists, and I've worked with poets, with performance poets, with mechanical engineers, with information people from the Forest Service, from our state Department of Natural Resources. I've gotten photographers have shared images with me. Lorena and I got some thoughts about sequoias from a California researcher. And I want to thank the museum for the opportunity to show the work and to give this talk. So I think we have a few minutes for questions.
We do. Thank you both so much. That's a fascinating look into both of your work. And we're just so thrilled to have you here at the Wildling. I know it's one of my favorite works in the show and definitely one for our visitors. And I think even though you're not from California, it's such a relatable topic for people to connect with. And Lorena's words, I mean, it's so amazing to hear in such few words. You paint such a vivid picture of what the wildfire experience can be. So thank you both. And for those who've been shy, you can start putting questions in our Q&A box or in the chat area. We did get one from Kevin who asked Suze, did you plan for the almost holographic effect that you created in your panels that are hanging at the Wildling?
Yes, very much so. It really seemed to me that when you had that transparent layer, it was almost, I don't think of it as a holograph so much myself as a video experience, a kind of, it almost looks as if, you know, there's the video lines somehow moving, but holographic is a good phrase, and I might have to steal that from you. But more, you know, my original impulse was really the ephemerality of fabric. And what's more ephemeral than something you can see through? And that kind of sense of motion is so different from our normal sensation of trees that can't move, you know. So yeah, it was very, very much intentional.
I was curious, because seeing all of your various installations, how many have you used this effect with?
Well, there are 30 sets of those trees with 14 stories by Lorena. And on that tour that it's still on, different places with different amounts of space have hung more or all of them. I think there have been 3 places now that actually devoted an entire, 1,000 square feet to hanging all of them. And some have put them in different rooms and you wander between them. So it's pretty flexible in that way. And it began touring at the beginning of 2019 and is going to be on the road until the end of 2023. So that's that and this, the tree that you have is the extent of the fiber, the fabric collection. But every time I do one of these paintings, I have it photographed in high enough resolution that it could be printed on fabric.
Do you ever exhibit your paintings alongside the fabric pieces?
Well, I never have, but I should say Stehekin Sentinel, our opener there, is now owned by the Bainbridge Island Museum of Art, a small regional museum, really a beautiful place over on an island west of Seattle. And they have shown both the fabric and the original. They bought both. They think of the fabric piece as a book, and that they have a major book arts collection.
Yeah.
So that's the first time I've seen them together.
Very cool. I had some questions that I was jotting down, so I'll just ask some of those while we're waiting for other folks. But Lorena, I was curious, what is your process like when you're writing amidst these, what I would think are very stressful situations? If you're out on a firefighting project, how do you find the space to write, or what does that look like when you're in the field?
I take a lot of notes, you know, or like in the case of that drive from Fresno, it was already actually landing in the plane at night. It was actually my flight got delayed from a storm in Denver. I was landing at like 3 a.m. and I could see, because there's so many lights in Fresno, you could see the yellow, you know, just that descending. And I mean, the poem was already starting at that point. And then, you know, I jotted that down, and it changed the next day on the drive, because I was like, everything's that color. The grass is that color. The dirt is that color. The air is that color. And so it was a lot of thinking on it, but it's usually quite a while before I really am able to figure out either what the metaphor is or what the literal interpretation is that I want to bring forward with the imagery. The imagery is really the part that's first for me. I can see the description. I know the words that I want to use to paint the picture in word form, but what it means is the harder part for me. And I think that's where the trees are a particular challenge, because there's the space constraints, there's the wanting it to coalesce with the painting, and trying to have it be as naturally flowing as possible without, you know, forcing it into a box. And so for these particular pieces, the process sometimes is Suze saying, I needed that thing yesterday, and me saying, okay, and making it happen. You know, my background is nonfiction, and I'm more of an essayist and long form. And so these short ones are a real challenge for me. And I think that shows sometimes in the amount of words that Suze has to help me trim.
Okay. Yes, no, I give her a word limit.
Yeah, it's a good thing. It's been really good. And actually we're sitting here talking, and I'm so excited about what the next tree is that Suze says, so I'm doing this thing. Maybe it's tiny trees next. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I don't think I can get bigger, that's for sure.
So how often, I mean, would you have seen the trees that Suze is having you write about? Is it often from her relaying her experience seeing them, and then you're translating that in your work? How often are you both seeing it in person at the same time?
I've never seen them. I've never seen the trees. I've never seen the exhibits. I've seen some of her work when we were in our collaboration together, but the fabric idea was brand new, like that week almost. It was really starting fresh. And unfortunately, the timing with the pandemic was such that when it opened in that Florida Museum in St. Petersburg, I had plans to go and see it in person and have never been able to. And so unfortunately, I have the same computer screen images as we saw today, but one day I'll get to see them in person. Well,
that's incredible.
Now, I should say, you know, Lorena was also a taskmaster, and when she agreed to do this, you know, she gave me a list of what aspect, you know, what facts she wanted about each tree. It's about a 30 or 40-page document, and it, you know, it has where was the tree, why did I pick it, what kind of forest was it, do I have any imagery, any photos of the surroundings. It took a fair amount of work to put the sort of the background document together.
Yeah, I wasn't kidding when I said I asked for a latitude
Right.
and
Yeah,
longitude.
no, and I could find them. I have been back to some of those trees. I have been back to Stehekin several times over several year intervals. And there was one there, it's called delimbed, it's very iridescent. And when I went back, it was gone. It had fallen over. But many of them are still standing. They stand for an astonishingly long time, depending on the many, you know, different factors. But
Well, I just want to say, knowing how much Stacy and I collaborate with various artists and other people, that you're able to do all of that and create the work that you do without even seeing the tree. I mean, you must be amazing collaborators. That's got to be tough. So,
Well, and Suze does all the layouts. I need to make sure she gets full credit for the visual. I send her a Word document and she takes it from
yeah,
there.
no, sometimes they're very challenging to fit those shapes. Yeah. Yeah, that the one from Mesa Verde with the pinion with the twisting and branches was was tough to make fit.
well, and I'm so curious. I mean, just the way you can't really predict, though you've probably figured it out along the way, but how the fabric will necessarily fall or lay with those corners and twists. I mean,
Yeah, no, it's somewhat limited. I don't think I could do a fabric version of all the incredibly tiny branches and have them cut out. I could probably do a transparent version, but yeah, no, there's some limitations. It's quite true.
Well, it's been wonderful to get this background on the collaboration and just the logistics of what you do to collaborate, as Lauren was saying. So thank you for that insight. I think sometimes these talks are as interesting to learn about the how-to. I always love learning about, well, how did that happen? Never mind just the aesthetics of the finished product.
Yeah, like I said, that the Simon Starling talk in Banff, the idea of connecting the process of what you're doing to the meaning of it was, you know, just a revelation to me, and has inspired me ever since. So yeah,
That's great. You never know where you're going to find that thing that, like you said, just takes you in a whole new direction. Thank you so much. We've hit 5 o'clock, so I think we're going to wrap it up, and unless there's any last minute questions, but I'm not seeing anything posted right now. Just really grateful for those of you still here. It's recorded, and Lauren will do her magic very soon and get that up. And just thank you guys so much for your time and effort in helping us with this talk and dialing in from your faraway places. And of course, for being part of this show, we're just really grateful.
you're welcome. I'm pleased people are getting something out of it.
they
Thanks for
definitely
having
are.
us.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you. Everybody have a great evening.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.